Hello and welcome everyone. And as you all know, there's a new RTS coming out next year that's called Iron Harvest 1920 Plus. And this is a strategy game that is set in a fictional alternate 1920, where the nations of Europe have developed these kind of giant steam-powered walkers that are, of course, the new standard of technology and can be used as weapons. And the game focuses on three factions based quite clearly on the German Empire, the Russian Empire, and Poland. These are Saxony, Rusviet, and the Polania Republic. Of course, I'll leave you to figure out which is based on who, which is pretty obvious. So while the world of Iron Harvest is actually unrealistic and implausible, it's clearly inspired by some very real events and concepts, which have shaped also the development of these three countries in real life. So I'll be trying to explain as best as I can these developments and concepts. First, we have, of course, the way the world looks and feels. You have probably seen a lot of the artwork, a lot of the videos that are coming out, and so you can see that this is a very, very clearly defined style that the game and the art is going for, and it's actually really awesome. It's set in a fictional version of Eastern Europe, and it's worth remembering that in our timeline, Eastern Europe, capitalism and the industrialization came late compared to our countries. So actually, the cultural perception of it was actually a little bit different as well. So by the time that the First World War arrived, you have that the major cities in Eastern Europe were rapidly developing and starting to industrialize, and this was leaving a social and economic gap between them, who were shooting forward and developing into the modern world, and the countryside, which was still kind of stuck back in feudalism. So you would take a Russian or Polish peasant, and he wouldn't really look out of place around the Mongol invasions, for example, 7 centuries earlier. Whereas, of course, the cities were starting to head into the modern age. They were developing industry, they were developing machines, and all of that. All of this really seeps into the game's art style and the world's sort of worldview, I guess you could say. So it wasn't really hard for the artist that actually created this world, whose name is Jakub Rosalski, and I'm probably going to leave a link down in the description to his site so that you can check out the art on which the game world is actually going to be based on. It didn't have that much to do to make the world look unique, just essentially juxtaposing the images of simple peasant village life and the modernity that was really starting to, at that time, seep into it, and that sort of threatened to destroy it. So you have these giant, awe-inspiring technological monstrosities, these giant mechs and airships and all of that, and it looks really cool. However invented these machines may be, the theme of man sort of being thrust into a modern world of machinery, machines, that kind of threatened to swallow him is kind of a classic one in essentially the culture and literature of the area and the world in general, as, of course, the industrialization and modernization of society really left some very, very deep changes in the social and economic structure of the world. And, for example, one famous Russian author, actually of the time period, Maxim Gorky, describes this kind of modern feeling, the feeling of being sort of oppressed by modernity, really well in his novel The Mother, and I'll actually be reading a page right now out of it. This is his description of the sort of new Russian factory that had just sort of been built in the countryside. So it says, "Every day the factory whistle belled forth its shrill, roaring, trembling noises into the smoke-begrimed and greasy atmosphere of the workingmen's suburb. And obedient to the summons of the power of steam, people poured out of little grey houses into the streets. With somber faces they hastened forward like frightened roaches, their muscles stiff from insufficient sleep. In the chill morning twilight they walked through the narrow, unpaved streets to the tall stone cage that waited for them with cold assurance, illuminating their muddy road with scores of greasy, yellow, square eyes. The mud plashed under their feet as if in mocking commiseration." And that's essentially the the way these kinds of modern machines must have looked like to something like a peasant out of nowhere that was either sent into a factory to work or actually conscripted in the army in the First World War. So whether it is a modern factory, an airplane, a tank, or a giant worker or an airship, this kind of effect of someone sort of getting thrust into the modern world is very, very much the same. So in that way, it's actually not very real, not very irrealistic, I guess you could say. The way this modern world portrays itself, even in a diesel punk alternate universe. And there's actually a YouTuber that describes this pretty well, very eloquently. I'll leave a link to that in the description below. So, in our world, millions of men have the first contact with this kind of new civilization that to them was unknown, actually in World War One, by being conscripted into the massed armies that fought there. So, of course, you have these massive mobilizations. Russia alone actually calls up 13.5 million soldiers by just the end of 1916, so not even the entirety of the mobilization, of whom over 10 million actually were farmers. Of course, Russia was one of the most agrarian countries at the time. And yeah, that was the first time they really saw any machinery that was bigger than like an ox cart or something. Inherent harvest, so the equivalent conflict of World War I is actually called the Great War as well. So it's very, very specular in that. In this Great War, supposedly the German-like faction of Saxony was defeated. However, 2 years since, war still rages in Eastern Europe. And the Empire of Saxony, of course, is still part of it. They're one of the three main factions of the game, even though they are defeated. This is actually historical because in real life, in the wars of the sort of disgregation and dismantlement of the Russian, Austrian, and German empires in the East, that left a lot of the earlier power structures still kind of in place. The power structures that had been built up to support the imperial expansion of these powers. So Germany was still very influential in the East, even after the treaties of Brest-Litovsk and Versailles. Brest-Litovsk being the one where they made peace with the new Soviet Republic, and Versailles, of course, the one where they made peace with the Western powers. Despite that, German forces still fought in the eastern part of Europe. And, of course, Saxony in the game is supposed to be a very powerful advanced country, so likely something similar is happening. So in our timeline, of course, these German forces still fight in Eastern Europe. They fight in Estonia, they fight in Latvia, in general in all the Baltic states, they fight in the Caucasus, they fight in the Ukraine, and they also fight in Poland. They fight with Poland as well, with the newly emerging Poland as well. And where does this sort of German power come from? Of course, historically, at the time, in the decades preceding the Great War, Germany had been sort of an industrial and technological leader in Europe. Of course, this was because they managed to unleash their sort of latent economic potential. Heavily supported by the state, the economy grew very, very quickly, and it became second only to the United States in production, in industrial production, but also in other sort of spheres of economic success, such as banking. So, especially in the steel, electrical, chemical industries, German corporations became really very, very influential. Became very powerful. They became very concentrated. With the help of the sort of influential banking sector, they also managed to form these big, giant conglomerates. In the US, there were the trusts. In Germany, there were also industrial conglomerates. And this was, of course, a level of concentration and efficiency in the economy that made the German economy second only to the United States and allowed it to have a sort of great advancement, not only in terms of economy, but also in terms of technology and society, despite its sort of weird hybrid autocratic regime. Another country with an autocratic regime, of course, was Russia. Russia, which is represented in the game as the Rusviet. Now, it's not the Soviet, it's the Rusviet, and it's very, very much the Russian Empire. It's not actually the Soviet variant yet, although in the game's description they hint they don't hide the hint very much that there's a revolution in the earth, so there might be a Russian revolution or whatever. Rusviet is based on the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire was of course, this giant, massive empire, which conquered all throughout Eastern Europe, and not just. But it was, of course, exhausted by the war, and its regime, of all the ones in World War I, was by far the most draconian and backward and oppressive. So this huge country had grown sort of into a sizable economy, partially thanks to its own size and partially thanks to British and French capital, which found essentially a marriage between itself and cheap Russian labor in the big Russian cities of the northwest. So your St. Petersburgs, your Moscows, your Tulas, your Smolensks, all those cities, your Novgorods even, to a smaller degree. So all these cities became more developed in the Russian northwest and some parts of the Ural Mountains, and of course some parts near the Black Sea, like Rostov-on-Don. But the rest of the country was very much still steeped in essentially a feudal state, in feudal-like conditions. So you have this developed and cosmopolitan center surrounded by some very, very rural periphery, and it's still part of a sort of this sort of socioeconomic tissue of Russia. And that's essentially their weakness. So it's huge, it's powerful, sure, but it's also kind of it's got a less advanced part of itself, a more backward and brutish kind of part to itself. And you can see that also in the way the units are designed. Like, for example, the Saxony units, they're all very sleek, they're all very modern looking, they're all very just in general, they look like kind of like wolves. They're ready to just pounce on you, and they're very, very striking. But the Rusviet ones, they're kind of like bears. They're a little bit more rugged and rough. You can see it in the design, and it's a very, very classic sort of German and Russian type of stereotype. Then the third country is, of course, kind of the most interesting. It's Polania, the Republic of Polania. This is based, of course, on Poland. Even the name is basically just Poland. Poland, in our timeline, at the time was established only in 1918 on November the 10th. It was actually established by Marshal Joseph Piłsudski. Probably mispronounce it, but it was established on November 10th, a day before the armistice ended the First World War. And while today's Poland seems like a weak country, and the historical narrative surrounding it is definitely one of the small and sort of plucky nation trying desperately to fend off these larger conquering empires to keep its independence time and time again and all of that. While that's the narrative, the truth is that Poland actually for centuries was the great power in Central Europe. So it's also got a background of imperial domination, essentially being at the head of this federal union of Poland and Lithuania. If you played, for example, Europa Universalis 4, you know about that, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which also at the time included parts of the modern-day countries of Latvia, Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova, and all these different Eastern and Central European territories. So it was very, very big, very, very powerful. And at the time, this was a country that, well, very, very successfully fought German states of the Holy Roman Empire and Russia for control over, again, Central and Eastern Europe, for hegemony. Not just Central and Eastern Europe, as in Poland, Belarus, and all that, but also the Baltic states, also the Ukraine especially. So in parts, very, very much also the aggressor against Russia, and at one point it even captured Moscow itself. However, it never managed to really properly centralize like later Germany was able to do, and like Russia famously with Ivan the Terrible and his successors eventually and very bloodily managed to do. So it couldn't really marshal its resources well enough to withstand the other powers in the age of absolutism, in the age of big giant empires that were eating up the map, the Ottomans, the Austrian Empire, later the German Empire, and of course the Russian Empire and the Swedish Empire. So this expansionist and cosmopolitan even area of Polish power at the time, like I'm gonna just share a story of mine. When I visited Krakow, which of course was one of the major centers of this Commonwealth, you can like really, really see the pride that people take in the fact that not only was this Polish state, strong and all of that, strong and big and all of that, but all of the architecture that comes from the period, you are gonna hear all about how engineers and architects from all over Europe participated in all of this. Not only all over Europe, but also all of the territories that made up Poland and Lithuania made great contributions to its culture, its literature, and all of that, especially Ukrainians and Belarusians, but also Lithuanians and all the other ethnic groups. So this is actually a very, very glorious period of Polish history that was remembered by parts of the Polish nationalist movement, which in the years after the partitions of Poland, was trying to restore the independence of Poland. And it simply was a past that could not be canceled by the Germanization and Russification programs that were enacted by the Kaisers and the Tsars to subdue Poland in their occupation. And of course, some Polish nationalists later took them as part of their political worldview, kind of, especially Marshal Piłsudski, who later sought to restore not only the independence of Poland, but also its leadership as sort of the main organ of a Central European federation that would essentially try to contain Russia, push it back to its natural borders, or whatever you want to call them, and liberate the territories and peoples that had been enslaved by the Russian Empire. So this concept was actually called Prometheanism, and it envisioned Poland as sort of a modern Prometheus, bringing the fire of independence to the enslaved populations of the Russian Empire, and rallying these Central and Eastern European nations into this sort of massive giant federation with Poland at the head, which was called the Intermarium, or the Between the Seas concept. And this, we'll see next time how this actually goes, because next time we'll be taking a look at actually the sort of geopolitical situation of post-World War I Eastern Europe, and the actual main conflict on which the game is, in my opinion, based, and I would say so, especially with the title 1920 plus. That's actually the Polish-Soviet War, which is a war that's not really well known all over the world.